everyone, my name is Miriam Hepler. I go by she, her pronouns, and this week I'm going to be presenting on LGBTQIA plus youth and mental health, which is pretty broad, but I'm going to be focusing on mental health and kind of like risk factors and some systemic issues which LGBTQIA plus youth face. So to start, I did want to put kind of a blanket trigger warning. There is mention of suicide throughout an entire slide specifically on risk factors for suicide. So if you either need to skip that or if you'd like me to just send you the presentation alone, feel free to message me or email me and I can send that. You can do that at your leisure if that's more comfortable for you. But I did just want to put out that as kind of a side note. For historical overview, which this focuses a lot on just the gay rights movement overall. So the gay rights movement really started to take a role like in the early 1900s. So it began evolving and became much more publicized in the 1960s, and that's about when the sodomy laws started being decriminalized. So that was kind of the first movement of just homosexuality being decriminalized all around and more of that acceptance coming into place legally. So Illinois was actually the very first state to revoke their anti-sodomy laws. And I thought that was interesting. I think typically a lot of people think of New York City and New York, but there were actually a lot of different protests and concerns that surrounded those areas. Terminology was in the 60s developing. So the term transgender and that definition actually was coined in 1965. And the first SRS or sexual reassignment surgery actually occurred in 1955, which I thought was very interesting. And that did occur in Denmark. And the first person to receive SRS actually male to female or MTF transgender. And they had previously been very involved in the military and things like that. So it's a very interesting story. I believe Christine Jorgensen is their name. So you can look into them and Google them up if you're interested. A lot of protests began to evolve from the 1960s on especially. So there was sip-in protests, and that's kind of a play on words for sit-in protests. And these occurred in New York City. So the sip-in protests were protesting New York City's laws or kind of commonalities in bars and different areas which served alcohol. They refused to serve LGBTQ plus or would serve them only and have them kind of off to the side and not allowed to socialize in their establishments. So sip-ins started occurring where people would come out in a bar, wait essentially to not be served, and then sue is kind of what was going along with that. And then very commonly known would be the Stonewall riots. And that sparked an entire string of protests, which lasted almost an entire week in New York. So that was after the police raided the Stonewall Inn, which was a very popular place for LGBTQ plus, especially drag queens. And that was kind of like the true identifying start of like gay liberation and the gay rights movement. In the primarily 1980s into 90s, we did have the AIDS crisis or AIDS pandemic. In 1992, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was instituted in the military. And so commonly known, but that was where gay and lesbian people were allowed to join the military as long as they were not going to disclose their sexuality. So then this was repealed under the Obama administration in 2011. And then in 2015, gay marriage was legalized nationwide. And so before that, there were different areas or different states who had legalized gay marriage on their own, but this became nationally recognized in 2015. Overall, the Pride movement has really been a big part of liberation. So things like Pride walks or the Pride Parade are very important, and they began actually as Lesbians and Gays Walk for Charity, and so that's, as I mentioned, like evolved into the annual celebrations for LGBTQIA plus, which would commemorate like the Stonewall riots. So I believe they occur mostly in the month of June, and many of the major cities host pride parades. So like Philadelphia, New York, Washington D.C., specifically on the East Coast, which is where I'm at. For an overview of LGBTQIA plus, kind of on its own, so that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, intersex, and asexual. The plus can stand for many different names, and or many different identities. I'm sure I'm not covering all of them, but gender fluid or gender non-conforming, as well as pansexual. So gender fluid and gender non-conforming fall under those gender identities. So some people consider gender fluid and transgender to be very similar, where you may not feel necessarily that you're falling under like the sex that you were born at any given time. Gender non-conforming falls more into the presentation. So you may still identify cisgender, but maybe the way that you present doesn't follow the typical or I guess more typical of what it would kind of look like, which is also where non-binary comes in. So, as mentioned, gender and sexual expression can definitely be very fluid. So that means that certain days you may be leaning more towards one gender or one sexual orientation, and other days it might be towards another. So there's some days that people will go by she, they, and other days when they'll go by specifically they, or maybe he, they, or different points in time in their life that may change. I find it very important to note that terminology definitely continues to develop. So it becomes increasingly inclusive, which is great. It can be difficult at times to keep up with if we're not really paying close attention, or if we're not having open conversations. So definitely making it a point to remain up to date and involved is extremely important. Specifically for youth, there's an estimated 1.3 million LGBTQIA plus high school aged youth. In 2019, the Trevor Project's national survey found that LGBTQIA plus youth are less likely to reveal their gender identity compared to their sexual identity, and only just over 50% of youth share their gender identity with their parents. Youth are most likely to share their sexual orientation and gender identity with friends, and they're at a higher rate they share their gender identity and sexual orientation with other LGBTQIA plus identifying friends. I have a few graphs from the 2019 Trevor Project National Survey that I found just extremely interesting, and I think very telling in a lot of cases. So this one specifically is about youth who reported someone had attempted to convince them or to kind of change their mind on their sexual orientation or gender identity. So it's well over half. So it's 67% of them report that someone had encouraged them or attempted to convince them that their coming out was essentially incorrect, or to kind of just convince them to reevaluate that. So this, as a trigger warning, does discuss suicide. So if you'd like to skip, feel free. The 2019 Trevor Project National Survey also found by gender identity and by age a lot of differences amongst suicidal thought and attempt. So transgender and non-binary youth considered and attempted suicide at a higher rate than their cisgender peers, and youth between the ages of 13 and 17 attempted and considered suicide at a higher rate than those aged 18 to 24. And then the one on the right kind of breaks down for those who attempted suicide, and 53% of youth who had attempted suicide do identify as transgender or non-binary, and kind of just exposing that 13 to 17-year-olds attempted at a almost 20% higher rate than 18 to 24-year-old youth. Specifically discussing risk factors for mental health. So compared to their heterosexual peers, LGBTQIA youth were about 2 to 7 times more likely to experience mental health disparities while in adolescence. They're also about 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and about 4 times more likely to have depression or depressive symptoms. I thought it was very interesting that they were specifically diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. A lot of the different studies had mentioned feelings of depression, or periods of depression, but not necessarily depression as like the DSM diagnosis. So I did find that a very interesting tidbit of information, that they are specifically diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder at a higher rate. LGBTQIA plus youth are also about 6 times more likely to have co-occurring disorders by age 21, and they're about 4 times more likely to develop conduct disorders. And overall, they do experience higher rates of traumatic stress that may be as a result of bullying or discrimination, but that's not necessarily the specific traumatic stress that they experience. In 2020, the report from the Trevor Project indicated that almost 50% of LGBTQIA plus youth wanted counseling but were unable to obtain it within that 12-month period. Over 70% of the respondents in the 2019 Trevor Project survey indicated feelings of sadness and hopelessness for at least 2 weeks within the last 12-month period. Concerning familial dynamics, only about 1/3 of LGBTQIA plus youth experience parental acceptance, and parental rejection also places youth at a 6 times greater likelihood of experiencing depression, which then also places them at a higher risk of considering or attempting suicide. Non-LGBTQIA plus affirming homes and schools placed youth at a much higher rate for mental health disparities. So youth reported about half of them experience affirming spaces in school, and about 1/3 experience affirming places at home. And they did find that having affirming schools actually had a very high impact on mental health in a positive manner. So it was interesting that having schools really does create that sense of space and that ability to either address concerns or just be healthy. 75% of LGBTQIA plus youth report discrimination on their sexual orientation or gender identity in their lifetime, and over half of them had experienced that in the last 12-month period. Specifically, risk factors for suicide. 40% of respondents in the LGBTQIA plus survey seriously considered suicide within that 12-month period. The Trevor Project 2021 survey found heightened suicide attempts for LGBTQIA plus youth of color. Black youth were at a 21% suicide attempt rate. Native or indigenous youth were at a 31% attempted suicide rate. Latina or Latino youth were at an 18% suicide attempt rate. And Asian Pacific Islander youth were at a 12% suicide attempt rate. And that is compared to white youth who had a 12% rate. So especially Native or Indigenous youth and Black youth had, there was extreme disparities within that statistic. And also 59% of Black LGBTQIA plus youth reported considering suicide overall, and 26% had attempted in the last 12 months.